Shalom and welcome to the Middle East Report. In this programme today we will be discussing Benjamin Netanyahu's historic election victory and his return for power and what that means for Israel and the Middle East, plus also the Jewish state's battle within the United Nations. Warm welcome to the programme, and today's special guest needs no introduction. His name's Zalmi Unsdorfer, a regular guest on the Middle East Report and the person really to talk about the success of Benjamin Netanyahu, his return to power as Israel's Prime Minister. So Zalmi, warm welcome to the programme.
Welcome, and nice to be here again.
It's a pleasure. So you must be very happy knowing that you are representing the Likud party here in the United Kingdom, and that Benjamin Netanyahu, also known as King Bibi, has returned to power against essentially what is essentially all odds and a political miracle. What are your thoughts on his historic election victory that will bring a stable and secure government to Israel that Israel hasn't seen for nearly half a decade?
Well, he comes back as probably one of the greatest statesmen of the current times. He's been Prime Minister for 15 years. I'm sure that no one was ever able to fill his shoes, not amongst any of the other members of the previous administration. And we have great hopes for a stable government, which hopefully will last the length of 4 years and restore some stability financially, in terms of security and the welfare of the nation.
Yeah, and tell me, the Israeli general election was back on Tuesday, the 1st of November, quite a while ago now. But we've seen in that time 5 elections within 4 years. Why does it take so long for Israel to have a stable and strong government?
I think I'd say probably jealousy and hate. I mean, the first election, which was in 2019. Bibi would have had a government had Lieberman, with his 6 seats, not walked out, because he wanted to crush the religious with a new draft law, but particularly he just did not want Netanyahu to enjoy another term in office and wanted to sideline him, and then that created a further resentment of other ministers like Saar and others, who basically said anyone but Bibi, and this is what's caused all these ructions.
And also share with us the previous government, because it was a government essentially that ran on a ticket anyone but Bibi, the most diverse government I think in Israeli history, from the left to the right, including representatives of the Muslim Brotherhood in that government as well. Can you share with us how this government lasted so long, as it were, with being led by Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid before Naftali Bennett's completely pulled the rug under him and the coalition fell apart? Well,
just basically, the dirtiest kind of politics. I mean, Naftali Bennett basically had, 5-6 seats in a 120-seat Knesset. And how does he get to be Prime Minister? Well, he gets to be Prime Minister because all the people who don't want Bibi are prepared to do anything in order to make sure that Bibi doesn't get into power. And that goes to even giving the Islamist Ram party something like $200–300 million in aid. I mean, they basically bought their way into, or they bought Bibi out of the Prime Minister's office. And of course, always the drumbeat of he's a criminal and all this kind of thing. And when any examination of the charges show how trivial they are. And I believe that he genuinely does want to face his accusers.
And also share with us as well, in the eyes of the Israeli electorate, and moving the kind of the left of Israeli politics for one side, because whoever is in power, they're always going to be against those in the centre, those in the centre right. But those particularly on the centre and the centre right, was this anti-Bibi coalition that formed the last government, did it lack legitimacy in the eyes of the Israeli people? And also explains why Benjamin Netanyahu did so well the most recent general election in Israel back in November.
Yes, I mean, certainly people felt that this was not a legitimate government. They knew perfectly well that Likud was the biggest power in the Knesset, but they were just deprived Likud of power because of this personal animus. And the media, of course, in the same way as the United States, the media is very, very much leftist and pro-democrat. The media was piling in as well, with the exception of perhaps Israel Hayom. All the other media is pretty anti-Bibi. So, it was a very uphill struggle, and this is how this thing bumped along for, 5 elections. What created this was a huge, huge groundswell of fear about the streets running out of control in terms of security, in terms of law and order, in terms of Arabs having too many guns, in terms of the Lions Den group breaking out in Nablus, all that kind of thing. That's what brought Likud back to power. And also, the attacks by the Lieberman party on the religious. The religious are the ones who got their vote out even bigger than the religious Zionists. The Torah parties, they actually had a very, very good result. And they're the ones that, frankly, put this bloc over the top. When you look at the original religious Zionist camp, which was Naftali Bennett and Smotrich, they had 13 seats. This time they have 14 seats. But Shas took in an extra 2 seats. So Shas gets a lot of credit for this, and I think they're going to get a very good ministry for this.
And does this signify a kind of shift in Israeli politics, a move towards the kind of religious right, as it were, that we probably haven't seen since the 90s? I'd
like to think that people in Israel, in terms of the whole, would become more Zionistic and more devoted to the sanctity of the homeland, as opposed to becoming a secular state made up of its people. And some of them want to become members of the European Union, which I think would be the most ridiculous thing for a Jewish state. But I think really this is mainly about security and, in particular, law and order. This is what's brought Ben Gvir and Smotrich to the forefront.
I will explain later who these individuals are, Yemi. But Zalmi, but Zalmi, I suppose the other big question really is it also a rejection of Yair Lapid's premiership? The fact that he presided over a centre-left progressive party and government, and also the fact that he was also pretty much following the lead of Biden when it came to his disastrous policies in the Middle East, not standing up on the nuclear threat of Iran posed to Israel, and was doing everything he could to accommodate Biden. Do you think also that played a major role in a lot of the Israeli electorate's thinking when it came to polling day on the 1st of November?
I don't think so. Lapid was not a bad guy. He didn't antagonize the religious as much as others did. He's basically a guy from media. He has absolutely no other background but in media. Not to deride the media, he's very telegenic and he's very able to express himself. I don't think there's much to say against him. But at the end of the day, he was weak on foreign policy. And yes, he was wrong to say to the Biden administration, and particularly Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, that Israel's not going to surprise you on Iran, i.e., we're not going to do anything in Iran unless we tell you well in advance. Well, that's anathema to the right wing. It's anathema to Bibi. Bibi was very, very upset about it, and it doesn't make any sense anyway to say that.
Absolutely. So let's have a look at that historic moment when Benjamin Netanyahu returned to power after the Israelis went to the polls on Tuesday, the 1st of November, that secured him an election victory and an incredible comeback.
The main possibilities to join Netanyahu would be the religious Zionist Party, as well as the ultra-Orthodox United Torah Judaism and Shas parties.
I think Israel is supposed to be democratic and Jewish. I don't accept the separation. I think that if Israel will be more Jewish, it will be more democratic, and it will be more democratic, it will be more Jewish, because the public in Israel is very strong in its Judaism.
Knesset and Religious Zionist Party member Simcha Rothman has seen an upsurge in support during this round. Many supporters come from communities in Judea and Samaria that have been sidelined by the current largely secular government and recently attacked by terrorists.
Israel is a very conservative society politically, in the way of life, in the culture, in the family. The second Israel will be able to decide its faith democratically, you will see the people choose more Jewish values, because that's what the people in Israel want.
Jews of American and European descent primarily make up the UTJ party.
The main two goals, first of all, to promote the interest of the ultra-Orthodox society, to support it financially, to give, for example, exemption from the army for the ultra-Orthodox men, the ability to study Torah, the support for the institute, the education system.
According to Gilad Malach of the Israel Democracy Institute, the party wants a stricter version of Judaism within society.
And the second thing is they want to promote keeping Shabbat as a day that there is no market, no transportation, to be more strict regarding conversion issues to Judaism and other religious issues.
Shas Party supporters are very diverse.
The voters of the Shas Party comes from all over. We have votes from the Arab villages. We have votes from downtown Tel Aviv. We have votes from Jerusalem. We have across the country. Because people understand for a stable future for the kids, they need to vote for Shas. Because no matter who you vote, you need to bring the following day bread to your table.
While the Religious Zionist Party and UTJ push for a more strict definition of who is considered a Jew and therefore allowed to immigrate to Israel, the Shas founder had a broader view.
Rabbi Ovadia Yosef was the only chief rabbi of Israel that recognized the Jewish people from Ethiopia as Jewish. It's known that people from Russia get recognition straight away that you're Jewish.
They also support the peace process.
Shas Party is the only religious party that joined the Rabin government in 1992. And we want peace, we're running for peace.
Julie Stahl, CBN News, Jerusalem.
And thanks to CBN for that excellent news report on the Israeli elections. Zalmi, looking back on it, back in October of 2022, Yair Lapid was speaking in front of the United Nations General Assembly, in which he called out his support for a two-state solution. Do you think it was that speech that really did put the nail in his political coffin, knowing that the Israelis haven't elected a prime minister on that platform for land for peace since Ehud Barak in 1999, which then saw the second intifada, which was one of Israel's worst terrorist wars that Israel faced, and then the Israelis came to the realization that land for peace only means terrorism. So do you think that speech was, even though he was cozying up to the Biden administration, actually hurt him politically at home?
I don't think anyone was surprised by what he said. And let's face it, Bibi Netanyahu also in 2009 gave a speech in Bar-Ilan University talking about his vision of the two-state solution. I think that was at the time a sop to Obama. There was huge pressure at the time, Israel's relationship with Obama. It's a toxic situation. I think one of Bibi's greatest achievements was surviving 8 years of Obama. We all know that the two-state solution is just it's a watchword. Everybody likes to use it, but it's never going to happen because the Palestinians don't want two states. They want one state, a state without any Jews in it.
No, absolutely. And also share with us, for example, the election result. So the election occurred on Tuesday, the 1st of November. It was a decisive victory for Benjamin Netanyahu, where he won 32 seats, which was 23% of the vote of the Israeli electorate, able to form a government with a right-wing bloc and then forming of a majority of 64 seats, knowing that you need 61 seats to form a government. So with 64 seats, how stable and strong is this government? And can he last the distance? Can his government last 4 years?
I think he certainly can. 64 is strong. I mean, we've seen governments in Israel, with a one-seat majority. So he won't be on a knife edge, Netanyahu, going forward. Obviously, he's got a huge challenge right now in choosing his coalition partners in terms of the demands that are being made by the right-wing religious Zionist party. I think the religious parties, the Torah parties, I think they're sorted. They're quite happy with, the portfolios which Bibi intends to give them. And in fact, some of them, the two factions follow different rabbis, and one of the rabbi groups says, don't take any ministerial jobs. It's mainly Smotrich and Ben Gvir of the new religious Zionist party that are asking ridiculous ministries like defense and finance and so forth. They're not going to get it, but right now they feel strong, so they're making a big noise.
Yeah, which is very much like Israeli politics. So can you just share with us how Israel's parliamentary system works? It's based on proportional representation, isn't it? There is 120 seats in the Israeli Knesset, and to form a government you need 61 seats. And of course, Likud won 32 seats in the last election. So not enough to form a government in there outright, so therefore having to rely on coalition partners or former coalition partners. Just explain to us how complicated the Israeli political system is, and so our viewers can understand what we're seeing now as this jockeying for positions and giving particular parties and leaders of those parties particular ministerial portfolios in order to make his government work.
Well, the proportional representation system is, unlike the British system, first past the post, means that a small number of parties can hold the balance of power. We see this happening in various European capitals. And in this particular case, we had Bennett's party last time, which had a balance of power. We had Lieberman was able to walk out of after the first election and basically turn us into this turmoil using just a handful of votes. I mean, I think he had 6 or 7 votes at the time. But basically, you vote for the party, and there is a threshold of 3.25%, and if you fail to meet that 3.25% of the voting total, of the total votes cast, you don't get in. That equates to about 4 seats. And you look at a thing like Meretz, which is the secular, very, very highly leftist party, which years ago was run by Yossi Beilin. He's the architect of the Oslo Accords. Okay, they had like 12 seats in its heyday, and it didn't make the threshold this time. So Meretz is gone. Labour, the Labour Party, was the dominant party for years and years before Menachem Begin of Likud overturned it in an election. And now they're literally on the bottom of the pile. What have they got? 4 or 5 seats.
Which is extraordinary, considering they produced the prime ministers such as David Ben-Gurion, Levi Eshkol, who else they produced as well? Itzhak Rabin, Shimon Peres, Golda Meir.
They were all of the Labour.
Yeah, and now they're nowhere in Israeli politics. But considering that there was a kind of 20-seat gap between the left and the right in this election, and a huge swing to the right, also to the religious parties as well. Do you think that Israeli society is changing? And or is this a kind of backlash to the kind of secularization that's happened in Israel for a few years? Or has the religious parties found their voice and able to mobilize their support base? What are the kind of social dynamics that have produced such a result in this election?
I think probably one of the biggest factors has been or was the rioting that broke out in the mixed Arab-Israeli towns like Lod after the last missile salvo from Hamas. There were apartment buildings in which Jews and Arabs had lived happily together, and then suddenly Arabs would come out of their apartment with knives. And this went back to the same kind of picture as we had in Hebron in 1929, where perfectly friendly and peacefully cooperating families of Arabs and Jews, babysitting for each other's families and so forth, suddenly just, with one word, Al-Aqsa, suddenly there was a butchery going on. And I think people on all levels of the spectrum, religious, secular, who were living in those towns, really woke up to that. and they say there's something wrong here. How come all these Arabs have got all these guns? Where did they get them from? And it's because of the lowering of deterrence that people like Ben Gvir got a huge vote for the right. And the other thing is rules of engagement. You know, IDF soldiers should not be held to trials and investigations and so forth just for drawing their guns. This whole leftist dogma, which we see of, you know, even we see this in this country with police. You know, a police officer, you know, can't apprehend someone unless he's prepared to face, you know, 2 years of investigation as to whether he was right in apprehending somebody, whether it was for racial or whatever other reasons. It's ridiculous. It just turns law and order up on its head.
Of course, the other example of that is in the States with places like Washington State and defund the police and what have you, and the Democrats calling for that. So yeah, it kind of fits in. But talking about the extraordinary politician he is, Benjamin Netanyahu. He is Israel's most successful prime minister, Israel's most longest serving prime minister, king of all comebacks. But the odds for him coming back were incredible this time, weren't they? Because he faced not only political but also personal challenges to overcome and be re-elected as prime minister again. He had his defectors in his own coalition parties that were against him, even people within the Likud party that didn't want him to stand. Faced prosecution by the Supreme Court on what pretty much looks like trumped up charges with very much little evidence. He had virtually the whole of the Israeli media against him. And he was in the opposition, and yet he was able to turn this around. So share with us what is so unique about Benjamin Netanyahu that the Israelis trust him again to run their country, and rightly his name is King Bibi. So explain to us how he was able to turn his political fortunes around and actually become prime minister again.
He is a master chess player. He has a tremendous knowledge of world leaders. He's had 15 years dealing with, you know, world leaders, from Angela Merkel to Trump to Obama to Bolsonaro, whoever it is. He's also created huge alliances for Israel in the African continent. He's obviously was key to the Abraham Accords. He is a statesman with very, very large shoes to fill. And there aren't that many statesmen on the stage today. You know, we see here in this country prime ministers coming and going. Oh, yeah, when's the last time you saw one, for 15 years? So really, he has that gravitas. He has also that ability to engage with world leaders. So, when you talk about Putin and all the issues with Putin, there's a very, very careful tightrope that he has to walk there. But nobody, in my mind, regardless of the fact that I'm a Likudnik, I can't see anyone who even comes close to filling his shoes. And I have full confidence that he will be able to steer his way into a coalition that actually works for the broad base.
So let's have a look at this new era for Israeli politics as Benjamin Netanyahu returns to the helm and the power of Israel's premiership.
Benjamin Netanyahu is working to build a new government coalition as he prepares to become Israel's prime minister once again. Israel's last election gave Netanyahu and his bloc of right-wing religious parties a 64-seat majority in the 120-seat parliament. Outgoing Prime Minister Yair Lapid's coalition won just 51 seats. Netanyahu called for national unity in an address to Parliament after the election.
After the election campaign is over, after the dust has settled, the bickering between the camps, you have to get out of the trenches and know how to work together. The differences of opinion will not disappear, and that's okay. In several areas, we have sharp debates, which also need to be managed with responsibility and consideration.
Netanyahu is expected to finalize a new governing coalition in the coming weeks, after President Isaac Herzog gives him the official mandate to form a government. I spoke with political consultant Eli Pipretz about Israel's latest election and how it could impact ties with the U.S. Eli Prieps, thanks for joining us on Jerusalem Dateline. It's been just about a week after the election. Tell us, what are your main takeaways from the results?
Thank you, Chris. I would say the main takeaway is, first of all, is an affirmation of Prime Minister Netanyahu's leadership. The country saw, Israel saw what leadership was like, what their government was like without him in power, and they found a government that was divisive, that was intolerant, something they wanted nothing to be a part of anymore. So the return to norm, return to traditional family values, traditional strength and security.
Those some of the main themes that you take away from the results?
Absolutely. I mean, you look at the level of voting. People voted primarily for Netanyahu at a very similar level as before. His support has not been eroding, but we saw parties that were very much affiliated with traditional values. Those parties went up significantly. You can look back, we had election just last year, 15% increase from last year. And you go back all the way to 2019, 4 years, 33% increase. That's a huge amount, and that's what propelled Netanyahu into what should be a very stable, right-wing, traditional values government.
A lot of the media internationally, and as I believe we were talking earlier, the Jewish media, have focused on Itamar Ben-Gvir. How do you explain that phenomenon, and how do you explain the kind of popularity he has right now?
Well, you know, Itamar Ben-Gvir is someone who is a bare-knuckles politician, someone who is not prone to social media, someone who is known for what he does on the ground. We have, similar to in the U.S., where you have a lot of crime, you have the inner cities, a cauldron. You look in Israel, and we have also quite a bit of terrorism, and people want answers. People don't want slogans. Itamar Ben-Gvir represents that. But I think more than that, what Ben-Gvir's support is solid right-wing politics. In Israel, you typically, in a parliamentary system, you'll have a major right-wing party like Netanyahu's. Then you'll have smaller parties to the right that keeps them in check. You might think of it in the U.S., you might have a Freedom Caucus on the right, you might have a Progressive Caucus on the left. So you have these parties on the right that keep Netanyahu right-wing. That's what Ben-Gvir's voters wanted, not necessarily anything else that the left in the U.S. And other places are trying to impose upon him.
There's been some reaction in the U.S., certainly for some politicians. How do you see the results affecting U.S.-Israel relations?
I think, unfortunately, too much of communication between this administration, the U.S., the Biden administration, and Israel is less about international affairs, more about domestic politics. They're trying to virtual signal to left-wing voters to say, hey, Israel, even Israel has racist intolerance. And unfortunately, that I think is going to run a little hollow. But that's the news cycle that we're in right now, and I think that they're going to continue doing that to the detriment of the U.S.-Israel relationship.
Are we going to see differences perhaps in the Iranian nuclear deal, U.S.-Saudi Arabian relations?
I think part of what we're going to be seeing in the election tonight in the U.S. Is a repudiation of a Biden administration that has been focused on legitimizing an Iranian regime that now we see how horrific they have been to their own people. That's not a reason why anybody is necessarily going to vote, but it is coloring the environment that we're in, this lack of leadership, and also this desire to engage with the worst elements to try to normalize them, try to mainstream them. Why? Because when you have a world of good and evil, that is very biblical. That's very traditional. And the left has an idea where they don't want the world to be seen in good and evil. They want to say, if we just give everybody some money, we welcome them into the world of League of Nations, everybody can behave. That is unfortunately not the real world. We saw that in Afghanistan, we're seeing that in Iran, and in Israel, we're seeing that with the Palestinian Authority. That's not acceptable, that's not going to work, and I think voters both in Israel and the U.S. are going to repudiate that kind of approach.
Well, Eli Prieps, thanks for your insight and analysis, and we'll see how the U.S. elections go.
Thank you.
And that's really kind of in-depth analysis there that we need when we're assessing this year's general election in Israel, which is their 5th election in a space of 3 to 4 years, which is incredible. Zalmi, now I have to tell you a little bit more. Now, we know with our kind of mainstream media that we have to take them with a kind of pinch of salt, that we have to do our own research. Now, we're seeing pretty much our own media, the Democrats in the States and others are wanting to picture this as an extreme right-wing coalition that could threaten Israel's international relations around the world. Can you just unpack some of the accusations made against this new government, particularly from the likes of the religious Zionist parties that will make up this coalition?
Okay, so it's the religious Zionist party, and then, as I mentioned, the Torah parties. The Torah parties, they're quite happy to discuss peace talks. You know, they're not opposed to a two-state solution. You know, they would cooperate with that. The religious Zionists, they are pandering to the extreme right movement. They don't want to see Judea and Samaria turned into a PLO state. And let's face it, they are right, because every single piece of land that Israel has vacated for the sake of peace has been taken over and turned into a rocket base. We came out of South Lebanon, it's now a Hezbollah rocket base. We came out of Gaza, it's a Hamas rocket base. We came out of Sinai, and it is an Al-Qaeda and ISIS and whatever else have you rocket base. People don't fly over there too much, and it's Egypt's problem. So we know that if we pull out of parts of the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, that it's going to be occupied by Iranian-sponsored proxies. And so these guys are realists, and I think it's important that that realism actually gets projected into a government format through these people. Yes, they've been very extreme and said some extreme things, but you know, lots of people say extreme things in their youth and in electoral campaigns, but once you're in government, as Ariel Sharon said, the world looks very different from the Prime Minister's seat.
No, absolutely. But it's also puts a kind of block on international attempts to push forward a Palestinian state. And obviously the world very much like Yair Lapid as its prime minister. He was doing the bidding of President Biden, the Democrats in the States. He was the darling of the Conservative Party in this country. The European Union liked him as well. We saw pictures of him meeting the president of the EU and what have you. So with this new government and with Bibi back in power, there's almost a message to the rest of the world that leave our homeland alone, leave Judea and Samaria alone, because we're not going to negotiate. Is that the message that this new government is sending to the international community?
Yes, I think it is. I think it's not just confined to Israel. I think the entire Gulf region feels itself as being under threat by Iran and the hegemony that Iran wants to have in that area. And also, all of these Gulf states are really, really disenchanted with the way Biden has turned America into a weak leader of the free world. The abandonment of Afghanistan, that was a huge shock to the system. The Saudis have got no love for Biden. As you know, Biden came cap in hand for oil and he didn't get it. So I can see the Abraham Accords strengthening under Netanyahu if Netanyahu projects strength.
Absolutely. So also, what will the return of Bibi to power mean for the US-Israeli relations? Like I just said in my last question, that under Yair Lapid, Israel had very good relations with the Biden administration, primarily because I think Yair Lapid was doing the bidding of Biden, following suit with his disastrous Middle Eastern foreign policy, not really willing to rock the boat in terms of the Iranian nuclear threat and some other geostrategic dynamics that we've seen in the region. So how will this change with Bibi back in power? I
think I really think that Bibi is able to steer this ship at least as well as he did under Obama. If he managed 8 years of Obama, he's going to be able to navigate the Biden administration's last 2 years. You know, even with this reactionary right-wing coalition partners, I think the Obama years burnished his credentials for that. So I have full confidence that he'll be able to run this ship through those seas.
And also, I think obviously Benjamin Netanyahu is hoping that the Republicans would also take both houses of Congress. They've won the House of Representatives, but look like they've lost the Senate. How much will that have an influence on, for example, pushing back on this Iran deal that the Biden administration want to push through? Even though that's beginning to change a bit now, because the international opinion is really turning against the Iranian regime because of its treatment, horrendous treatment of its women who are protesting for their freedoms, and then supplying Russia with these military drones that are killing innocent civilian people in Ukraine and all over Kiev.
Well, you know, I honestly feel the hand of the Almighty in that particular arena, because Biden and his team were desperate to sign with Iran, as were the EU partners in that group. All of them wanting to sign for financial reasons. They wanted to get contracts with Iran, they wanted to get oil from Iran, they wanted to do all of that, get all those lovely petrodollars in. And Iran just kept playing hard to get, and there was no real explanation because their economy was so far on the ropes. Now it's become toxic, obviously, with the drone deliveries to Ukraine and being on the wrong side of history even further. There's no real explanation. When something completely against the grain happens in foreign affairs, then you've got to assume that there's some outside interference, and I think that's the case.
Amen to that. And also, we've seen that really Benjamin Netanyahu is really the only statesman in the West now that has that kind of moral authority on the world stage and has that a moral compass, as it were, because the rest of our leaders seem to have completely abandoned the traditions of standing up for freedom, standing up for democracy, standing up for democratic institutions, standing up for religious freedom, and wanting to spread liberty around the world. Those core values that made the West strong seem to be abandoned in the present time. So how do you think Bibi returning back to power in Israel will be able to convince the world of the Iranian nuclear threat and also be able to protect Israel's interest by saying that the Iranian nuclear threat not only poses a threat to Israel, but also poses a threat to the Arab world, to Europe, and even the United States with its ballistic missiles?
I think he will use the Iranian threat to deepen the ties with Gulf states. Obviously, Qatar won't be on that list, not for a long time, I would have thought. But I think that's a powerful incentive for unity in the Gulf. And as I say, he's got the gravitas of 15 years as Prime Minister to be able to traverse the world stage and actually intervene where necessary. And he's shown himself to be able to intervene and go over Obama's head into the Congress, get 15 standing ovations for appealing against deals with Iran. So, you know, even now, you have an older Bibi, a wiser Bibi, perhaps a more humbled one because he's been sitting in opposition, you know, for all these months, 18 months and so forth. So I have confidence that he'll steer that way forward.
And how do you think that Bibi will respond to one of the most pressing issues that Israel faces, and that's the security issue the north of Israel's border? Hezbollah mounting anything between 160 to 180,000 rockets targeting Israel. The Iranian proxies and terrorist organizations and the Iranian Revolutionary Guards in Syria with something like 90,000 troops at their disposal as well, that poses a real threat. And particularly now as the Iranians are trying to supply Hezbollah and their terror groups with laser precision guided missiles, which is a game changer in the Middle East. So share with us how that situation has deteriorated over the last 18 months and how do you think Bibi will react to this security threat on Israel's northern border?
Well, in the Lebanon, you know, Nasrallah's been kept in the box. I don't think he's actually ventured out of his bunker in 5 years. And that wasn't because of COVID, that was because, you know, targeted assassination. Lapid did this deal on the gas field with Lebanon, which was attacked by Netanyahu at the time. But I don't think Netanyahu is going to negate that, because if they have gas, then Lebanon has more to lose. The more they have to lose, the less chance they're going to loose 200,000 rockets onto Israel. And as far as Syria is concerned, I think Israel will continue to take action against Iranian deliveries and supply routes, just as they did before, with or without Putin's help.
Absolutely. And talk about President Putin. Israel's relationship with Russia has always been a complex one, but now it's become a very cold one. As we're seeing that Putin has closed down the operation of the Jewish agency inside Russia, which is a bad move, and also seeing that he's also blocking Russian Jews from making allies to Israel. It's essentially coming against the God of Israel and putting a stop to Jewish immigration to Israel. How do you think Benjamin Netanyahu will respond to this challenge, knowing that before he's had an amicable relationship with Putin and has been able to have some influence over him?
Well, Putin has had a brain drain. Lots of people who were fearing the draft into Ukraine have left. Their brightest and smartest and strongest have all left. They went, they skedaddled over the border. So he probably doesn't want to lose a lot of Jewish brains in that. So there could be that dimension. But I believe this is very, very temporary. This is all local politics. I don't think they're going to stop Jewish immigration to Israel or anywhere else and become like a prisoner state or a jail state as it was all those years ago. I don't see that happening.
And what are your thoughts about the comments made by Russia's previous president, Medvedev, who is a puppet of Putin, who warned Israel that if Israel supplies Ukraine with the Iron Dome missiles, then Russia will turn a blind eye to Israel's military offences against Hezbollah and against Iranian terror proxies in Syria and in Lebanon, which would make it so much more difficult then for Israel to push back the Iranian threat in those countries without the current support or green light from Russian military personnel, knowing there's a huge Russian military presence in Syria.
Well, you have to understand the background to this is Israel has taken in per capita more Ukrainian refugees than any other country. That's number one. Number two, Israel has seen several times its technology, when it's given out weapon systems, it then finds its way into its enemy's hands. So it's very, very careful about where it sends something like the Iron Dome. And number three, the Iron Dome is really not even suitable for that particular environment. The Iron Dome is dealing with Hezbollah and Hamas missiles. It's not dealing with artillery, shells, and the kind of drones that are being sent and waged against Ukraine. So there's a lot of rhetoric going on over here. And let's also not forget, in view of the United Nations scenario, that Ukraine was constantly voting against Israel in the United Nations. They were constantly voting with the Palestinian initiatives at the time. So there was a bit of animus there openly, notwithstanding that, for the civilians of Ukraine, we all feel for them, and we hope that it comes to a very, very swift end.
No, absolutely. Now, we have to understand when it also comes to Benjamin Netanyahu that he is really the architect of the Abraham Accords that we talked about in this program, the historic peace agreements that Israel signed with the United Arab Emirates, and also with Sudan and Bahrain as well. And there was even possibility of talking about Saudi Arabia coming board and more Arab states coming board, including Indonesia. Now that Bibi is back, do you expect the Abraham Accords to now flourish as he will push back on the American influence on the Middle East, which was to continue its failed policies of propping up this Iranian regime and also propping up the Palestinian Authority when so many of the Arab Sunni states have moved on from these failed policies that the US and the EU and Britain has pursued really for the last 70 years?
Well, the Abraham Accords have been very successful. They started off with fear because obviously the common enemy of Iran. But the trade and the security relationships have flourished and deepened. The United Arab Emirates has got Israeli tourists coming out of their gills, and I think that Bibi will deepen those. I think you'll probably see him making a lot of visits, official visits to these areas. As for Saudi Arabia, a lot has been normalized with Saudi Arabia in terms of flight routes and so forth. But I don't think there will be formal recognition as long as King Salman is on the throne. But I think once Mohammed actually takes over in full, I think you will see that normalization.
Absolutely. And also, isn't there the aspect of this one, because of the Biden administration's treatment of Saudi Arabia, they don't want to give the Biden administration a foreign policy gift by establishing diplomatic relations with Israel and the Saudis that the Biden administration will take credit for. That is also a major factor.
Absolutely. That is a very good point.
Also, have to ask you as well, when it comes closer to home, now we've seen, sadly, Liz Truss, our former Prime Minister, only lasted 45 days in office, but she did make quite an incredible announcement that she was looking into the prospect of moving the British embassy from where it is now in Herzliya to Jerusalem, which would have been an historical move on behalf of the British government. But now we see that we have Rishi Sunak in power. He's pushed back on that idea. How much do you think this will have an impact on British-Israeli relations, particularly as Benjamin Netanyahu is back in power and the Conservative Party were really in love with Yair Lapid?
I think that Britain will be one of the last European nations to move its embassy to Jerusalem because its foreign office has been so Arabist and is still so Arabist. And I think Liz Truss may have said something, but it wasn't going to happen as long as the deep state are in charge. And let's face it, we know that the deep state are in charge.
Absolutely. And also, what do you think it means now for evangelical Christians, such as our viewers of this program, to know that Benjamin Netanyahu is back, because he's done so much to reach out to evangelical Christians around the world, and particularly in the States, and also here, and kind of values that Christian support for Israel. How do you think this will now change now that he's back in power and understands the real friends of Israel are the evangelical Christians?
Well, the Judeo-Christian relationship is built on history, on deep, deep roots of history. And all of the other politicians, they're in the moment. They're always dealing with the current crisis in the moment. Netanyahu is always refraining to deep parts of history, biblical history, when they find some artifact, under Jerusalem someplace. He just goes off on a complete tangent because that's where his passion is. And he therefore is able to engage with the Christian community much, much more clearly. And let's face it, you look at a place like Bethlehem, since, in the last 70 years, since Israel was founded, has lost 70% of its Christians. They've been ethnically cleansed by the Palestinian Authority. That's the cradle of Christianity. So, Bibi knows this and he talks about this, and I think his roots are very, very deep with the evangelical Christian community.
And Zalmi, share with us the challenge that Israel is currently facing in the United Nations, particularly as the United Nations passed a resolution requesting that the International Criminal Court of Justice weigh on in Israel's, and this is what they said, prolonged occupation, settlement and annexation of Palestinian territory. And why is this so dangerous for Israel and her ability to defend herself from Palestinian terrorism?
Well, it was never Palestinian territory, it was Jordanian territory, as we all know. And even Jordan then gave it up and also happened to have lost it in a defensive war that Israel had to fight. So by all legal definitions, Israel is not an occupier. And besides which, as the United Nations Ambassador Erdogan said, you cannot be an occupier in your own homeland. So I think this is going to go nowhere. In 2004, we had an ICJ move about the security fence being illegal. Does anybody remember anything about that? It's just going to go off into the wind, and another Palestinian initiative just to deflect from its corrupt practices.
So let's have a look now at the challenges that Israel faces within the United Nations and how the international organization known as the UN is pretty much biased against Israel.
For 5 turbulent years, Danny Danon served as Israel's ambassador to the UN. While representing the Jewish state, he confronted anti-Zionism and defended Israel against charges of apartheid and racism. Danon also found allies in those diplomatic battles, like former U.S. UN Ambassador Nikki Haley. His new book, In the Lion's Den, Israel and the World, Danon takes readers behind the scenes and onto the front lines of his UN tenure. He covers his successes and disappointments from the UN General Assembly to the back rooms, as well as the spotlight of the UN Security Council. Danon also lays out a vision of Israel's future as a major player in the Middle East and how the relatively tiny nation can contribute to global peace and prosperity.
Well, former Israeli UN Ambassador Danny Danon joins us now from Jerusalem. So welcome to the 700 Club, Ambassador.
Thank you for having me, Gordon.
Explain to our viewers why Israel bears the brunt of most UN resolutions.
Unfortunately, in the UN, instead of dealing with the real atrocities all around the world, they focus on Israel. I think it's pure anti-Semitism. And I tried in my book, In the Lion's Den, to explain where it's coming from. Anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism. But I'm optimistic by nature, Gordon. And I was able in the UN to build bridges, to create partnerships, and to overcome those challenges. Hate will be there, but we can also bring hope by building bridges. Take, for example, the agreements we signed with the Gulf countries in the Abraham Accords. So things are possible also for Israel.
Well, during your time there, you also had an ally in this bridge building. It was former U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, who also wrote the foreword to your new book. How much was that a help, and how much did that change the game, if you will, when she arrived at the UN in 2017?
Ambassador Haley is a great friend of Israel, and we are grateful for her support and love for the people of Israel. But look at the timing. She came immediately after President Obama pushed forward a resolution condemning Israel. And I want to remind you, Gordon, that in that resolution that came on December 2016, Resolution 2334, it actually called our presence in the old city of Jerusalem a flagrant violation of international law. That was a very hard moment for me to be there in the Security Council by myself, fighting not the Palestinians, not the EU, but actually the US who was pushing that resolution. So Ambassador Haley came immediately after that, and together with President Trump, they changed a lot at the UN. We are grateful for moving the embassy to Jerusalem, for pulling out from the Iran deal, a recognition of the Golan Heights, and many more great initiatives. We worked on them together.
I vividly remember that resolution and remember thinking, how in the world could the U.S. do this? And then, just a few months later, Israel celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Six-Day War, where in the Jewish quarter you could actually now have Jews again. It's curious, that whole moment, it brought to my mind, just how long this struggle is. And you say in your book that the foundation for a successful foreign policy is a victory mindset. What do you mean by that? And then how do you get to that?
Well, we have to realize that we have allies, we have friends, but we have to count only on ourselves. That's the story of the Bible. And it's still the story of our modern state of Israel today. We have a strong military, and we are capable of defending ourselves. One of the lessons I learned at the UN, when Elie Wiesel, of blessed memory, who survived the Holocaust, he always told me, Danny, listen more carefully to the threats of your enemies than to the promises of your allies. And that's exactly what I did. And we should continue with that. We should look at what's happening today in Tehran with the nuclear agreement, and to realize that we have to be strong to protect ourselves.
Well, that threat of a nuclear Iran is hanging over the Middle East right now. How serious is that threat, and what can be done to stop it?
It's a real threat, not only for us, also to our allies in the region, the Gulf countries. They are worried about the radical ideas coming from Tehran. And I cannot understand why the administration in Washington is actually running to sign another agreement with Iran while they know that they are lying all the way. I hope there will be no agreement and that the US will stand with Israel. It is a threat for the stability of the region, and also it will allow Iran to send hundreds of millions of dollars to their proxies who promote terrorism in the region. And we are facing a wave of terrorism in the last few weeks here in Israel, Gordon.
Another excellent report put together there by our friends at CBN, talking about the menace that is the United Nations. Zalmi, I want to thank you so much for really unpacking for us the Israeli election results and the return of Benjamin Netanyahu to power and back in the centre of Israeli politics. But how can our viewers watching the programme really get behind Israel and the Jewish community? Because we know that we're all facing a battle at homes with a rising cost of fuel prices and energy costs, and just daily living has become such a struggle. But it's so important as Christians that we fight back and push back this wave of Jew hatred that we're seeing today, and this hatred being directed at Israel as well, and to speak up and become more vocal. What are your practical suggestions?
Well, the pen is mightier than the sword. It's very, very easy. From the comfort of your own home, you can write to your new congressman. You've got a new House of Representatives, those who are in America, and those who are outside of America. Social media is the platform where Israel is constantly being demonized. And if the evangelical Christian world was to really get their act together, as they, in fact, they do all the time, but if they redouble their presence on social media, especially now that Twitter is going to probably be freer than it was before, that would be a really good thing to do. And to say, why are you demonizing Israel? Why are you supporting the Iranian regime? Why are you not standing up to the human rights abuses in Iran? That kind of thing.
Zalmi, I just want to thank you so much for being this week's special guest, and really appreciate your contribution to the programme. It's always a pleasure to have you on the programme. Thank you.
Good to be here.
And I just want to thank you for watching this programme at home. Clearly, we've unpacked the Israeli general election results, and we see the return of Benjamin Netanyahu, who's become Israel's most successful prime minister in Israel's history. And so we've got to continue to pray for him and his new government, but also we need to expose the lies and the bias within the United Nations. So I want to thank you for watching this week's edition of the Middle East Report.